The bell had rung 20 minutes ago, but Ethan Kingsley was still sitting at his desk, staring blankly at the paper in front of him. It wasn't that he was reviewing his answers or waiting to speak with the teacher. He just didn't want to move. Moving meant walking out into the hallway where whispers would follow him like shadows, where someone would inevitably make a joke about how the Kingsley heir couldn't even pass a high school exam. Moving meant walking toward another night of silence and disappointment at home. The large red F on the top of his test paper felt heavier than the pages it was written on, as if it had soaked into the paper and made it too heavy to lift. Ethan wasn't used to the kind of failure people thought he should be capable of. His whole life, people assumed that being the son of Robert Kingsley, a billionaire who owned half the real estate in the city, meant he had an advantage in everything, that the world would simply bend around him and clear his path. But what they didn't know, what they never saw, was the quiet war he fought every single day inside his head. They didn't see him sitting at his desk at midnight, staring at pages of notes until the words blurred into meaningless shapes. They didn't see the frustration in his clenched fists when he tried to solve math problems that seemed to mock him with their cold, unyielding logic. It wasn't for lack of effort. Ethan had tutors for every subject, some of the best money could buy. His father hired them without hesitation, as though writing a bigger check could guarantee better results. They came to the Kingsley mansion with briefcases and charts, confident smiles on their faces, ready to fix him. And at first, Ethan would believe maybe this one would be different. But within a week, it was always the same. They would grow frustrated with him when he didn't remember something they'd explained 3 times already. They would glance at their watches when he stumbled over the same mistake again. Eventually, they'd tell his father that he just wasn't applying himself enough, or needed more discipline. That was the worst part. The moment his father heard those words, Robert Kingsley didn't raise his voice often, but when he did, it was like the sound filled the entire house. "You're a Kingsley, Ethan," he would say, pacing the living room like a general scolding a soldier. "Kingsleys don't fail. Kingsleys win. You have every resource, every opportunity. What excuse could you possibly have?" Ethan never had an answer. Because how do you explain to a man like his father, a man who'd built an empire from the ground up, that his own son's mind just didn't work the way the world expected it to? At school, the pressure was different but just as suffocating. The other kids knew who he was. Some were jealous, some were curious, and a few tried to befriend him for the wrong reasons. But when it came to academics, the whispers were merciless. "How do you fail with that much money? Bet his dad could buy the school if he wanted. Probably pays people to do his homework." Ethan learned to keep his head down, to avoid raising his hand in class, to sit in the back where no one would notice when he couldn't follow along. He became good at pretending to take notes, pretending to understand, pretending he wasn't counting the minutes until the day ended. Home wasn't much better. The Kingsley mansion was enormous. High ceilings, gleaming floors, and rooms so big his footsteps echoed, but it often felt more like a museum than a home. His father worked late most nights, and when he was home, his attention was a prize Ethan rarely won. Meals were quiet, each bite of food tasting more like obligation than comfort. His mother had passed away when he was 10, and since then, the warmth in the house had faded. It wasn't that his father didn't care. Ethan knew deep down that he did, but Robert Kingsley cared in a way that felt more like a business deal than a father's love. Achievements were celebrated. Failures were problems to be solved. That afternoon, after another failed test, Ethan stayed behind in the classroom until the last possible moment. His teacher, Mrs. Harper, glanced at him sympathetically before leaving. She had really tried to help him, but even she seemed to be running out of patience. When the room was finally empty, Ethan stuffed the paper into his bag, hoping he could crumple it into something small enough to hide from himself. As he walked into the hallway, he kept his head down, moving quickly past groups of students still chatting by their lockers. It was exhausting carrying this invisible weight everywhere he went. People assumed he was spoiled, that he didn't care, that he didn't try. But the truth was he cared too much. Every failure was a cut he couldn't hide, and over time, the cuts had piled up until it felt like he was bleeding in places no one could see. He tried to imagine what it would be like to succeed for once, to bring home a test with an A on it, to see pride in his father's eyes instead of disappointment. But that felt like imagining another world entirely, one he didn't have a map to. The hardest part wasn't the grades themselves. It was the way they seemed to define him in everyone's eyes. Teachers, classmates, even family members. They all saw the red marks on the paper and assumed that was the sum of who he was. No one saw the hours he spent trying to make sense of his textbooks, the late nights where he read and reread the same page until the words felt like static in his brain. No one saw the quiet frustration of trying to explain to himself why he could remember the lyrics to a song after hearing it once, but couldn't recall the formula he'd written down 5 minutes earlier. Sometimes, lying in bed at night, Ethan would wonder if he was broken. If maybe something inside him just didn't work the way it was supposed to. His father never talked about things like learning disabilities or different ways of thinking. In the Kingsley world, there was one way to succeed, through relentless discipline, through effort that never stopped, through willpower so strong it bent reality. And if you couldn't do that, you were simply weak. Ethan hated that word. Weak. But some days it felt truer than he wanted to admit. That night, after the failed test, dinner was especially quiet. Robert Kingsley came home later than usual, setting his briefcase down and loosening his tie before sitting across from Ethan at the massive dining table. The space between them felt like miles. For a while they ate in silence, the clink of silverware echoing in the cavernous room. Then, inevitably, his father asked, "How was school?" Ethan hesitated. "It was fine." Robert's eyes narrowed slightly, the way they always did when he sensed he wasn't getting the full truth. "Another test today, wasn't there?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah." And he wanted to lie. To say he'd done okay, maybe not great, but better. But lying would only delay the inevitable. "I failed," he admitted quietly. The look on his father's face was not anger, not exactly, but something heavier. Disappointment. Frustration. Maybe even confusion, as if he still couldn't understand how his son, with every advantage imaginable, could keep falling short. "Ethan, I don't understand you," Robert said finally, setting down his fork. "You have everything. Tutors, the best school, all the time you need. And yet," he shook his head, "Kingsleys don't fail." Ethan stared at his plate, wishing he could disappear into it. The next morning, the air in the hallway felt heavier than usual, like the school itself knew he was carrying another failure in his backpack. Ethan moved slowly, his steps quiet, hoping to slip into class without having to make eye contact with anyone. But his teacher caught him at the door and asked him to stay after the bell. That alone sent his stomach twisting into knots. When the final student had filed out, Mrs. Harper handed him the test paper he'd turned in 2 days earlier. He didn't need to flip it over to know what it said. He could already feel the shame pressing down on him. "Ethan," she said gently, "you're bright, but you keep making the same mistakes. Is something going on?" Bright. The word hit him like a cruel joke. Bright people didn't fail this much. Bright people didn't spend hours studying only to blank out the moment a question stared back at them. "I'm just not good at this stuff," he muttered. Mrs. Harper sighed. She looked like she wanted to say something more, but instead she gave him the kind of smile teachers give when they've run out of solutions. "I know you're trying. Don't give up on yourself." But as he walked down the hall, clutching that paper, giving up felt like the most logical option. He passed the lockers, the bulletin boards, the noisy groups of students swapping gossip, but none of it registered. All he could think about was the expression that would be on his father's face when he saw the grade. Again, Ethan reached the end of the hallway, heading toward the back exit to avoid the main crowd, when he heard a deep humming echoing from somewhere nearby. It wasn't a song he recognized, but it was warm, rhythmic, like it carried a bit of comfort in each note. He turned the corner and saw Mr. Carter, the school janitor, mopping the floor with slow, practiced movements. Mr. Carter wasn't like the other adults at the school. He never rushed, never looked too busy to notice the kids passing by. His uniform was always neat, his silver-streaked hair trimmed close, his dark skin lined with years of sun and smiles. But it was his eyes that stood out, steady, observant, as though they could see through whatever mask you wore. Ethan might have walked right past him, but that humming made him pause. For reasons he couldn't explain, it felt like an anchor in a day that was drifting too far away. Mr. Carter glanced up and caught his eye. "Morning sun," he said with a nod. Then his gaze shifted to the crumpled paper in Ethan's hand. Bad day. Ethan forced a shrug. Just another test. Didn't go well. Mr. Carter leaned on his mop, not with the kind of fake interest people sometimes showed, but with the kind of stillness that made you feel like your answer actually mattered. You say that like it's no big deal, but your shoulders are telling a different story. Ethan blinked. My shoulders. Yeah, Mr. Carter said, smiling faintly. You're carrying them up by your ears like they're holding the weight of the world. Means you're thinking about it more than you're letting on. Ethan didn't know why, but that made him laugh just a little. I guess I'm not hiding it very well. Not from someone who's been there, Mr. Carter said, his tone easy but serious. You ever think maybe the problem isn't you, but the way you're being taught? Ethan frowned. Everyone says I'm not working hard enough. Working hard's not the same as working right, Mr. Carter replied, setting his mop aside. He walked over to a nearby table, motioning for Ethan to sit. The cafeteria was empty now, just the faint smell of breakfast lingering in the air. Mr. Carter reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was covered in what looked like little sketches and notes. This, Mr. Carter said, laying it flat, is how I learned math back in the day. Not with numbers first, numbers used to scare me, but with pictures, shapes, stories. If someone told me 2 + 2 = 4, it went in one ear and out the other. But if they said, you've got 2 apples and someone hands you 2 more, how many apples you got? I could see it in my head. Made it real. Ethan studied the paper. The drawings were simple, almost childlike, but there was something about them that clicked. You had trouble in school? Mr. Carter chuckled. Son, I failed so many times. I thought they were gonna start naming the seats after me. Teachers thought I was lazy or slow. Truth was, my brain just needed a different kind of key to unlock the door. Took me a long time to find that key. For a moment, Ethan didn't know what to say. No adult had ever admitted something like that to him before. Every tutor, every teacher, every relative had always made it sound like failure was a choice he was making. What happened? He asked quietly. What happened? Mr. Carter said, leaning back. Is I met someone who believed I wasn't broken. Just different. They taught me one thing I'll never forget. Don't fight your mind. Learn how it talks, then talk back. Ethan turned that over in his head. What does that mean? It means, Mr. Carter said, if your brain likes pictures, give it pictures. If it likes stories, give it stories. If it learns better by touching, building, or moving, then that's your way in. You can spend your whole life trying to force yourself into someone else's way of thinking, or you can figure out your own. Only one of those roads will get you anywhere. Ethan hesitated, feeling a strange mix of hope and skepticism. So you think I could actually get better at this? I don't think it, Mr. Carter said firmly. I know it. But you gotta stop seeing yourself as the problem. Once you change that, the rest gets a whole lot easier. Something in his tone made Ethan believe him, even if only for a moment. It was the first time in a long time he'd heard an adult talk to him without judgment or impatience. Mr. Carter didn't look at him like a broken project to be fixed. He looked at him like someone who already had what it took, just needed the right map to get there. They talked for a while longer, the conversation weaving between school struggles and little stories from Mr. Carter's own life. How he'd worked dozens of jobs before finding peace in the simple routine of cleaning the school. How he still read every night even though no one was making him. How he believed learning was something you could do at any age. Ethan found himself smiling more than he had in weeks. When the bell rang for the next class, Ethan stood reluctantly. Thanks, Mr. Carter. I don't usually talk to people about this stuff. Then I'm honored you did today, Mr. Carter said with a warm grin. Now go on, son. And remember, stop fighting your mind. Start listening to it. As Ethan walked away, the crumpled test paper still in his bag, it didn't feel quite as heavy as before. The grade hadn't changed, and his father's reaction would probably still sting. But now, for the first time, there was a sliver of possibility in the back of his mind. A whisper that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't doomed to keep failing forever. Maybe he just needed to find his own key. That night, as he sat at his desk, he took out a blank sheet of paper. Instead of copying formulas from the textbook, he drew small pictures, little boxes, arrows, shapes to represent what he was learning. It felt strange, even a little silly at first. But then, almost without realizing it, something clicked. He remembered a concept from earlier that he'd always struggled with, and this time, it stuck. Not perfectly, but enough to feel different. Enough to make him want to keep trying. He thought of Mr. Carter's steady eyes and the certainty in his voice. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel like he was studying just to avoid failure. He felt like he was studying to understand on his own terms. The next few days felt different for Ethan, though the outside world wouldn't have noticed. The halls of the school were still loud with chatter, the teachers still moved briskly through their lessons, and the piles of homework still sat waiting on his desk each night. But somewhere deep inside, something had shifted. Something subtle but steady, like the first turn of a key inside a long locked door. It wasn't that he'd suddenly started passing every test or that studying had become easy overnight. Far from it. But now, whenever he stared down at a blank page or a confusing question, Mr. Carter's words would float into his mind. Stop fighting your mind. Start listening to it. Ethan had been taught all his life that success came from sheer force. Push harder, work longer, discipline yourself until you could break through any barrier. And he tried that. He tried it until his nights blurred into one another, until the pressure to be someone he wasn't made him feel like he couldn't breathe. But now, for the first time, he considered the possibility that maybe the problem wasn't his effort at all. Maybe the ladder he was climbing wasn't even leaning against the right wall. On Friday afternoon, after the last bell, Ethan made his way to the back hall again. He found Mr. Carter just where he'd hoped, in the quiet stretch near the cafeteria, pushing his mop slowly down the polished floor. The janitor looked up and smiled, as though he'd been expecting him. "You've got that look again," Mr. Carter said, leaning on the mop handle. "What look?" Ethan asked. "The look of someone who's starting to ask the right questions." Ethan hesitated before taking a deep breath. "You said last time that I might be climbing the wrong ladder. I've been thinking about that all week, but I still don't know what you meant exactly." Mr. Carter motioned toward a bench along the wall, and they both sat down. The hallway was quiet, the faint hum of the vending machine the only sound in the background. "Son," Mr. Carter began, "when I was your age, I thought the only way to get anywhere in life was to follow the same steps as everyone else. Teachers said to take notes this way, study for tests that way, memorize exactly what was on the board. I tried and tried, but nothing stuck. I thought maybe I just wasn't cut out for learning. Then one day an old neighbor man never finished school himself, sat me down and told me something I've never forgotten. If you're climbing a ladder and it's leaning on the wrong wall, no matter how high you go, you'll never get where you're trying to be." Ethan frowned slightly, turning the words over in his mind. "So, you're saying all this time I've been working hard, but toward something that doesn't even fit me?" Mr. Carter nodded. "Exactly. The way you've been taught to learn, the way they measure success here, it's not the only way. But you've been forcing yourself to use tools that don't match the way your brain works. That's like trying to dig a hole with a spoon when there's a shovel right next to you." The metaphor hit Ethan harder than he expected. He thought of all the late nights spent forcing himself to rewrite notes he barely understood, the endless drills that left him drained but no closer to passing. So what's the right wall? How do I find the right ladder? "That's the part only you can answer," Mr. Carter said. "But I can help you start looking. Think about this. When do you feel like you actually get something? Not just remember it for a test, but understand it deep enough that you could explain it to someone else." Ethan thought for a moment. "I guess when it's connected to something real. Like if it's part of a story or something I can picture in my head. Just reading words or numbers doesn't do it for me." Mr. Carter grinned. "There you go. That's your first clue. Your mind's a picture painter, not a numbers machine. If you try to learn like a numbers machine, you're climbing the wrong ladder. But if you turn everything into pictures, stories, examples you can see and feel, you'll be surprised how far you can go." They sat in silence for a moment, letting the idea settle. Outside, a basketball bounced on the blacktop, and the muffled sound of laughter drifted in through an open window. "When I was in school," Mr. Carter continued, "I started rewriting my notes into stories. If I had to remember the steps in a science process, I'd turn them into a little adventure in my head. If I had to do math, I'd imagine it as trading things at a market. At first people laughed, said it was childish. But my grades started going up. Not because I was suddenly smarter, but because I'd stopped trying to think like someone else and started thinking like me. Ethan stared at the floor, his mind whirring. It sounded so simple, yet no one had ever suggested it before. Everyone else had treated learning like a fixed road. If you couldn't keep up, you just had to run faster. But maybe there was more than one road. Why didn't anyone ever tell me this? He asked quietly. Mr. Carter gave a soft laugh. Because most people don't believe there's more than one ladder. They think their way is the only way. But here's the truth, your mind's not broken, son. It's just built differently. And once you know how it's built, you can stop wasting time trying to fit it into someone else's frame. For the first time, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not a sudden burst of confidence, but the faintest glimmer of relief. It wasn't all his fault. The years of being told he wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't focused enough, wasn't disciplined enough. They had carved deep doubts into him. But now there was a new thought, one that felt almost dangerous to believe. Maybe I'm not failing. Maybe I've just been learning the wrong way. Over the next week, Ethan began experimenting. Instead of copying his history book word for word, he sketched scenes from the events he was studying. Tiny stick figures in battle, ships on the ocean, little buildings labeled with dates. For math problems, he drew coins, boxes, or arrows, turning abstract numbers into something tangible. It felt strange at first, even a little silly, but to his surprise, things started to stick. Not everything, not perfectly, but more than before. One afternoon, as he was working in the library, he caught himself explaining a science concept to another student using a quick drawing on a scrap of paper. She actually understood it and thanked him. That small moment stayed with him the rest of the day. At their next meeting in the quiet hallway, Ethan told Mr. Carter about it. It's like the more I turn things into pictures, the more I remember them. It's weird. Not weird, Mr. Carter corrected with a grin. It's natural. You found your ladder. Ethan smiled, though there was still a hint of doubt in his voice. It's just, what if this doesn't work forever? What if I'm still not good enough? Mr. Carter leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Son, ladders aren't about being perfect. They're about getting you to the place you want to be. Once you get there, you can grab another one or build your own. But you'll never get anywhere if you keep climbing someone else's and hoping it'll magically take you where you're meant to go. Those words stayed with Ethan. For so long, he had been measuring himself against standards that didn't fit him, against people whose minds worked in ways his never would. But now he understood something important. Success wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about becoming the best version of himself. By the end of the month, Ethan still had challenges. He still had to work harder than some of his classmates, still stumbled on certain types of problems. But the crushing hopelessness was gone. In its place was a quiet determination, fueled by the belief that he wasn't doomed to fail. He was just learning how to climb the right ladder one step at a time. And every time he felt the old doubt creeping back, he remembered the steady voice of the man with the mop, who had seen past his grades and straight into the truth of him. You're not broken. You just think differently.